Thank you all for being here to learn about this wonderful woman. The research on these two took me on quite a journey itself, but one that wasn't nearly as adventurous and intrepid as the life journey of these two artists. And along the way, I learned a lot about the way things were nearly 200 years ago. When Ludmilla and Thaddeus Welch moved to Santa Barbara in 1906, their tramping days were over, but what an adventurous life it had been before arriving here. And once here, Ludmilla especially really came into her own and became involved in all things cultural and artistic in Santa Barbara. The photo shows them both in front of their home on Sola Street. But to tell their story, we need to start at the beginning with Thad, who had lived a full life, even before meeting and marrying the 16-year-old Ludmilla Pilat when he was 39 years old. Thaddeus Welch was born in Indiana in 1844, and his long road to becoming an acclaimed landscape artist had begun even then. Lured by the prospect of cheap land and the promise of a prosperous future, Thad's father packed up his fledgling family and joined an orderly wagon train for the journey to the land of milk and honey, Oregon. The advertisement shows the bucolic scene as the pioneer family arrives to start carrying out a life in where soon there will be a tidy town, complete with church and mercantile establishments, as well as bountiful harvest and river commerce. The top frame, as you can see, there's the covered wagon. They're chopping down the trees. This is the Willamette River. And then down here, you see the mercantile store, the church, and even river traffic. And that's what they were all hoping for and planning for and working for. The reality of the journey, however, was exceeded only by the reality of making a farm out of the wilderness. By the time he was 8 years old, Thad was expected to put in a full day of work on the farm. When he lagged behind, he was brutally berated and sometimes beaten by his father. Thad's mother tried to protect him, but was busy producing additional farm labor. That he wasn't cut out for farming became obvious. He was, however, interested in more cerebral activities. When Thad was 11, he was asked what he wanted for his birthday. And what he wanted was a pair of shoes and an accordion. There were few books available, but he read them at night by the light of a rag soaked in oil. At one time, he worked extra hours for a neighbor chopping wood so that he could earn the money to buy a violin. When he was 16, with his younger brothers now helping on the farm, his mother arranged for him to be apprenticed to a blacksmith. Here he learned the craft of making metal objects such as pots and pans and nails and hinges and anything metal. His wages were sent home. But then his father left to try his luck in the gold fields, and Thad had to go home and work on the farm. When his father returned in 1863, Thad took off for Portland, where he apprenticed with a printer. Having no money, he made his home in an abandoned boat on the Willamette River. While there, he became intrigued with the world of art when a client came in with a sheaf of watercolors that he had painted and wanted it bound into a book. Thad was entranced and decided he wanted to try his hand at painting too. Then, when his aunt introduced him to tube paints, he spent all his spare time attempting to paint the landscape. This is Oregon in 1879. That's Portland, I should say, in 1879. And it is a little bit further advanced than when Thad was there apprenticing. After his apprenticeship, Thad joined the ranks of tramp printers. These were highly skilled printers who chose a life on the road. They traveled from one print shop to another across Canada and the U.S., always in search of work. The life suited Thad perfectly. He could work until he had enough money to buy paint and immerse himself in the glorious landscapes and paint all day long. Thad made his way to San Francisco in 1866. He looked for work as a tramp printer and continued his attempts at painting. His work began being noticed, and soon several sponsors stepped forward to finance art studies in Europe. One of these was a widow, Mrs. Lisette Dennison. In 1874, Thad left for the Munich Royal Academy of Fine Arts, where he had many adventures with fellow art student John H. Twachtman, who would eventually become a famous Impressionist painter. This is a stereotype of, or whatever it's called, a photograph of the Royal Academy of Art in Munich, where he studied for 4 years. And this is what it looked like at the time that he was there. That first summer, Twachtman and Thad partnered up to become tramp artists, traveling the countryside with a collapsible wagon studio that Thad had invented. Twachtman's painting from 1882, which you see here, shows the influence of the Munich school, which emphasized a naturalistic style and a strong contrast between light and dark. At one point, Twachtman and Welch spent time at a tavern owned by a friend of Twachtman's. When they departed several weeks later to resume their tramp, the 16-year-old daughter of the abusive tavern keeper begged them to take her along. They agreed, and there being sort of a attraction between the two, Thad decided that he should marry her. While Twachtman was off painting, Welch and the girl got married at the village church, which you can see up in the upper portion of the picture. 4 years and 2 children later, the stars of romantic love were long gone from the girl's eyes, and she demanded he get a real job. Welch took her back to the tavern and her mother, the father now being long gone, and Thad also obtained a legal separation before heading for Paris. Oregon had kept tabs on Thad. He had become a favorite son as his fame as an artist grew. The Portland paper reported that he had 3 paintings in the Paris Salon. At the end of 2 years, the Thad studies were completed, and he returned to the United States in the spring of 1881. He went to live with or near Mrs. Lisette Dennison, who had a home on the Hudson River near Ossining. He took commissions to paint portraits when he wasn't painting landscapes around the district. One day, while he was sketching a wooded creek, he encountered Ludmilla Pilat, a 14-year-old schoolgirl, and her sisters, and became acquainted with the Pilat family. Ossining is mostly famous, if you can see what this little red dot's going for Sing Sing the prison. It was so infamous that eventually the town changed its name officially to Ossining, and is in this district that Thad painted and the Ludmilla and her family lived. This is a photo of the Pilat family in front of the Dale Cemetery Superintendent's cottage. Carl Pilat Sr. and his wife Anna had come to the United States in the 1860s as refugees from a political coup on which he had been on the losing side. His brother Ignaz Pilat had become earlier and established a nursery in Ossining, New York, but was quickly offered the job of assistant landscape architect for Central Park by Frederick Law Olmsted, a position he retained for the rest of his life. Carl, who had first settled in Georgia, moved his family to Ossining to take care of his brother's business. Carl then became superintendent of Dale Cemetery, and his son Louis took over the nursery, which operated well into the 1950s. And you can see Louis's house and offices, as well as the greenhouses or glass houses in this photograph. Ludmilla, and this is a self-portrait of her that is in the exhibit. She was born in 1867, was the firstborn girl. 3 sisters and a brother followed. She grew up in a house filled with music and literature and art, and with a strong belief in a thorough and well-rounded education. One of the things I love about doing research like this is that learning what life was like for people who lived back then. And I lucked out when the Ossining Historical Society Museum offered to send me 48 pages of Ludmilla's journal. Ludmilla's journal, which began in 1880 when she was 13 years old, was written on old ledger paper. And it's interesting to note that coffee was 45 cents a pound, and rice was 10 cents a pound, and gentlemen, if you wanted a silk necktie, it was only $1. Each and every day of her journal begins with a weather report. Monday, April 12th, was quite cold and sometimes overcast, and that morning the temperature had dropped to freezing. Most of the 1880 journal deals with what's going on at school and what her friends were doing. She's quite proud that she answered all the arithmetic questions correctly and gives the score for each of her classmates. Apparently, Amy ails Miss 2, but Amy's sister Gertie, like Ludmilla, Miss none. And Ludmilla remarks, always having been smarter than Amy, very junior high. This photo shows the teachers of the Groton School. Miss Carrie Gorton, standing second from the right, was Ludmilla's favorite teacher in 1882, and Ludmilla had a bit of a crush on her. Ludmilla often brought her gifts from the Pilat nursery and loved collecting her hello, goodbye, and thank you kisses. Now, I was an 8th grade teacher. I did not kiss my kids goodbye. Okay. One of Ludmilla's favorite novels was this 300-page book written completely in rhyming anapestic meter. While telling the story of star-crossed lovers, it was a bestseller and first published in 1860. Ludmilla adored it. To catch a flavor of the storytelling, I'm going to attempt to anapestically read the first few lines. And the title of this section, Canto 1, is a letter from the Comtesse de Nevers to Lord Alfred Vargrave. And he says, or she says, I hear from Bigorre you are there, I am told. You are going to marry Miss Darcy of old. So long since you may have forgotten it now, when we parted as friends, soon mere strangers to grow, your last words recorded, a pledge what you will, a promise the time is now come to fulfill, the letters I ask you, my lord, to return. And that sets up the whole book. It's all about that. Okay, so 300 pages later of anapestic storytelling. Even the dialogue being that way was quite something. Okay, life was not all schoolwork for the Pilat family and friends. Here they are at the nearby Croton Beach on the Hudson. Ludmilla is not in this photograph. That's her youngest sister, Teresa. This is one of her brothers, and this is another one of her brothers. And they are obviously having a fun day at the beach. Now I'm supposed to get it out of there. Okay. Ludmilla stopped writing in her journal, but picked it up again in 1882. By then, she had met Mr. Welch. And and he often appeared in the journal as a guest in their home. He had drawn a picture in her autograph book, which was a very popular thing to do. You gave your friends an autograph book, and they would write something to you in it, or draw a picture, or write a poem, and then they would give it back to you, and then you'd pass it on to somebody else. Anyways, in the autograph book, and Mr. Welch also joined in with other friends of the Pilats in gatherings and visits. This one, I will read to you also. Okay, we start with the weather report. We will have rain soon. We need it badly. Saturday, July 29th. This afternoon, I went over to Miss Gorton's with the rose bush Hugo gave me, and Hugo is her first cousin, and also a few roses. I had 2 kisses from her. They were both very sweet. Sunday, July 30th, Carl Jung's birthday. Louis went down last night, weather cooler, went to Sunday school. Miss Jennings goes there. In the afternoon, Mr. Welch came, also Hugo, and off they go to an adventure. All this time, Thad had been painting the countryside. In June, he painted Parade Day at the local military academy. Ludmilla's last entry reads, "Magnificent splendor of the northern lights." And Mr. Welch, who knows a great deal, says he believes this is the most wonderful representation that ever was. It was beautiful, and it lasted from 8 until after 10. The heavens fairly quivered, and the great waves of light rolled up to the heavens. It frightened Annie and the children. You know, she's so grown up now that her sisters are the children, very much. But Mr. Welch and I watched it with great interest. We saw 10 stars shoot, and altogether, it was a wonderful evening. And if we ever see another while we live, we will be lucky. This is her last entry. Tragedy, however, strikes when they lose their first child in February. At some point, Ludmilla had begun taking art classes from Thad. This painting of Ludmilla's in 1883 depicts the Jug Tavern in Sparta, which is today a national landmark. For the next 9 years, Thad pursued commissions throughout the United States and Australia, anything to make money from his art. He painted for the Prang Greeting Card Company. He taught plein air landscape painting, and he had a studio in Boston. For the Chicago World's Fair, a team of artists painted the murals that he had designed for the California building. And I'm going to find this thing again. Okay. This is, can you see it? That's the California building at the Chicago World's Fair of 1892-93. And if you can see this well enough, the facade on that side should look very familiar, for it is none other than the Santa Barbara Mission facade. Okay. In 1889, Thad opened a studio in Denver and had been in New York, New Mexico, and Arizona for 2 years. Between 1890 and 92, he also traveled back and forth to Australia, painting cycloramas. Ludmilla's father died in 1892, and during this time, Ludmilla seems to have disappeared into the role of wifedom or something, and her name is not mentioned in the newspapers, not even as Mrs. Thaddeus Welch. Cycloramas were a rage in the 1890s. They were round buildings, and these murals would be painted in them that were depicting an event in a particular setting. Thad was in charge of the Battle of Gettysburg cyclorama painting. He was assisted by a team of other artists to paint this one. And as you can see, there's the photograph. And I guess they must have changed them out, because this one is now the Battle of Waterloo. As I said, Ludmilla's father died in 1892, and Thad was back from Australia. In fact, he was in California painting marine landscape scenes, which he planned to take back to New York and his home on the Hudson. The Vacaville Reporter seems quite miffed that he is leaving. And the last sentence says, "A sale of these pictures right here on the coast would convince Mr. Welch that our appreciation of art is not below the New York standards. He belongs to us, and we hope his pictures will remain here if he cannot. Okay. Thad certainly thought he belonged to California as well. In 1894, he and Ludmilla moved to Mill Valley, where they camped and spent the days painting, often together. When winter came, they rented an unfurnished house for $4 a month because that's all they could afford. Thad's 17-year-old daughter, Fannie Welch, had arrived in New York in 1894 as well. She was an artist and would marry John Pillsworth, an engraver and commercial artist who revolutionized silk screening through his innovations. So I present you with this map of a portion of Marin County, basically because this is the area that I'm going to be talking about next. So they were here in Mill Valley. This is where they were living. This is called Steep Ravine, which will have something to do with our story as we go forward. This is Bolinas Bay, the town of Bolinas, and this is where a camp called Willow Camp was, and today this is called Stinson Beach. I don't know if any of you have ever been in that area, but you can see it's that northern part of. Okay, so now I'm supposed to get this off of here again. Okay. So at this point, I'm going to let Ludmilla tell her story because, once again, she has written it down. And she talks about how all this part of her life evolved. She says, "One day, while living in Mill Valley, we took a moonlight walk over to Bolinas." That's only about 15 or 16 miles, by the way. Over to Bolinas, and we found when we reached Lone Tree that the fog had come in so thickly that we had lost the trail. And after wandering about for a while, we crouched down in the shelter of a rock to wait for daylight. When it was light enough to see, we found we were not far from where the trail pitches down into Steep Ravine. We continued on and had breakfast at Willow Camp, which was kept by Bill Brown. The photograph you see is a photo from the 1880s of that area. You can see how mellow and uninhabited it was. And Willow Camp, oh, here we go again. Okay, the Willow Camp is kind of like right in here, in this area. Okay. On our way home, we explored the steep ravine more carefully and fell so much under the charm of the place that we decided to build there if we could get permission of the Tamalpais Land and Water Company. And the photo you see is that trail today. The trail still exists. In May or June of 1896, we went to Willow Camp, and while camping there, began to build the Steep Ravine cottage. The lumber came up on the schooner from San Francisco, and then was hauled for us by the Portuguese ranch hands to where the road curves to go into Steep Ravine, where it was slid down to where the house was to be built. Mr. Welch had no one to help him but me, but I soon became proficient in the use of a saw and hammer and helped him shingle the roof. I remember what a job it was to get the heavy timbers up for the second story because the lumber came up as deck load and was soaked with salt water. And again, this is the trail that they would go down to the beach on today. And here is the house that Ludmilla and Thad built in Steep Ravine. And she continues talking about this. She says, "When the lumber dried, there were cracks all over, so there was plenty of ventilation without opening the windows. In fact, it was a couple of years before we felt we could afford the windows, so we tacked muslin over the openings. When we finally got windows, our cat tried to walk through because he had never seen glass." Mr. Welch was very inventive, and he could do almost anything in the house, a hinge door, or sort of double action so that the cats and dogs could go in and out as they wished. A way to get the water out of the creek by simply standing on the back porch and turning a crank. We had sweet peas and hop vines and geraniums, and I can't see the rest of this. Oh, there we go. They had geraniums. So we always had plenty of color. Once a hop vine came through a knothole and wound all around the pictures, and even bloomed in the house. Once our pet skunk, who lived under the house, came in through the swinging door and had an encounter with the dog. And the next day I had to give the dog a bath and scrub the room. We were very happy living in those beautiful surroundings, even if we did have to walk 4.5 miles to post a letter, and we're 15 miles by road to the nearest railroad, and we're living principally on mussels and mushrooms. Okay. And another view of it with their pond, and this is, in this picture, hopefully you can see it's Ludmilla and Thad are sitting down by the water. Does that show up for you? Anyways, she continues, this more to the story. Our walls were covered with the sketches as we made them, and occasionally someone would come along and buy one, and we were happy to see that blank space. When we wanted a hot bath, we walked down to the beach, following the creek, and we bathed in the sulfur spring. This could only be done at low tide, otherwise it was underwater. The 2 cats and 2 dogs followed wherever we went, even for miles, so it was quite a procession when we went sketching. At that time, Mr. Welch sold pictures for $5 or $10 that afterward were sold for $250 or $300. That was a lot of money then. We lived in the steep ravine cottage for 5 years, and they were very happy ones. We made many friends with the wild animals about there. The quail used to stay in our garden, and even in the trout in the creek knew us. Mr. Welch had built a dam across the creek. You can see that in the foreground of the picture. And we had a little lake. Our cottage, with all its vines and bright flowers, made such a pretty picture with the reflections in the water. That was fine for the trout, too, for we used to feed them, and when we walked along the shore, they would swim along beside us. Life was about to change for Ludmilla and Thad, and there would be many blank spaces on the walls of their house after 2 members of the Bohemian Club of San Francisco were hiking and discovered them and bought several canvases, which were an immediate hit with their friends and associates. Thad became eventually a member of the club, and San Francisco galleries vied for his work. Unfortunately, the damp, cold winters had taken their toll on Thad's health, and they moved to San Geronimo for his health. What you're seeing in the picture on the right is an advertisement for a fundraiser for the Bohemian Club, which is trying to buy the Bohemian Grove in the Redwoods. Thad donated paintings to the sale for sale so that they could help, that would help to buy the Redwood plot that they wanted. The photo you see on the left is actually in the Santa Barbara Historical Museum's collection. It is a picture from one of the conventions that they had in the Bohemian woods and Bohemian Grove. It's where they had high jinks and low jinks, and the power brokers of the world gathered to make decisions on the sly. Anyways, this is someone dressed as Pan. They had lots of little plays, too. While living in San Geronimo, they also had a commission from Henry Bothine, who was a San Francisco manufacturer as well as real estate investor. They stayed at his summer home in Ross while making studies for the paintings. Interestingly, Bothine and his second wife, Ellen Chabot, moved to Santa Barbara around 1914, where Bothine built today's Piranhurst in Montecito, and as well as Maricel, which we know better as the Tea Gardens. Unfortunately and the picture shows the Tea Gardens back in 1927 at the top there. The house that you see below that picture is Bothine's house in Ross, and that, of course, is Henry Bothine. While living in San Geronimo, I'm halfway through. The climate of San Geronimo proved to be worse than that of Steep Ravine. And when they decided to move to Santa Barbara for the winter, when the earthquake and fire destroyed much of San Francisco in 1906, they decided to stay. In Santa Barbara, they purchased a house with a 2-story barn at 411 East Sola Street. And again, that is Thad at the doorway and Ludmilla standing at the front porch. This is the 1907 Sanborn fire insurance map, so you can get a sense of the outline of the structures. The X through the smaller building actually shows that it is a barn indeed. This is a photo of the house today, at least the side of it, and a peek at the 2-story barn, which became and was enclosed as a studio and workshop for Thad, and is today apparently a dwelling. This painting of Ludmilla's shows Santa Barbara's Art Study Club, which was founded in 1899. At their exhibition at the Arlington Hotel in 1907, they reported that they had a new and gifted member. That year, the reviewer wrote, "Conspicuous in the collection were the oil studies of a new and very gifted club member. The subjects were mostly local landscapes and were painted in a big way, showing great natural talent and magnificent technique." That member was Ludmilla. Thad, seen here in his elder years, spent his time between painting the Santa Barbara landscape, replacing his Marin County paintings, which had been destroyed in the San Francisco fire, and puttering in his studio and his workshop, and inventing things. He and Ludmilla painted separately and together until his death in 1919. Ludmilla's sister, Anna Pilat Welch, was a writer and an editor, and she came to live with Ludmilla in Santa Barbara. They participated in the fledgling post-World War I cultural renaissance in Santa Barbara, which began partially with the coming of Arthur Farwell and the community chorus idea. Both Anna and Ludmilla joined the chorus and sang at the Ojai performance that Farwell had directed in 1920. And, okay, and what you can see, there it is. This is Arthur Farwell standing up on the bench. This is Ojai. And this young man seems to be his guest conductor. And he's tickled by it. And all of these people were in the community chorus in Santa Barbara in 1920. And Ludmilla and Anna are among them, and I have no idea, of course, which ones they are. By this time, Ludmilla was finally being acknowledged for her own work, and art dealers said that her style and Thad's and expertise was hardly distinguishable. She spent her time painting the local landscapes as well as portraits of pets. But she also became entranced with the vanishing adobes in Santa Barbara, whose portrayal had been a project of the Art Study Club. This, the Adobe Cookhouse, we have a photograph of, but it no longer exists. Ever thrifty, Ludmilla painted and sketched on whatever surface was available. Here is one on the back of another. Cigar box lids were a favorite surface for painting, but strong cardboard was also satisfactory. Ludmilla painted the Gonzales Ramirez adobe on Laguna Street before Mrs. Murphy Vey, architect and artist, reimagined it through her preservation. One of the things that these paintings show you is that the original adobes did not have tile work extending over the porches. The tile was just over the main part of the building, and there are shingles across the portico or porches, and I particularly like the little cart port that they have on the side. She also painted the Gonzales Ramirez adobe as part of a landscape painting that she created. You can see this particular scene is bordered by De La Guerra, which we're on, Santa Barbara, and Canon Perdido streets. In this painting, she uses the Gonzales Ramirez adobe as a feature in the landscape. I think I've got that. Laguna, Santa Barbara? Yes. That's right. Notice the marshland in the foreground, possibly the remains of the Delic era gardens. And if you want to see this, okay, wait a minute. This is an 1890s photograph of the Gonzalez Ramirez adobe with a very similar viewpoint of that you just saw. And the mountains in the background and things. And to really understand, I'm going to put them together. You can see that the Gonzalez Ramirez adobe is still in both pictures, almost in the same position. The barn, which is in the lower picture, has disappeared, but there's still some dwellings there. All those trees on the right have really grown up and grown big. It's a really interesting comparison, and we just kind of lucked out that we happen to have this 1890s photograph. Her painting for the destruction of the old Libero Theater is the only image I have ever seen of this process, and you can see the old Libero Theater, the new Libero Theater, and that one wall, which sort of seems to be here, but I'm not 100% positive. You can kind of see that there. By 1922, the fact that she's included in an LA Times article proves that she's been accepted as a legitimate artist in her own right, although she still retains the Mrs. Thad moniker. She's in good company here with this little article, well, it was a big article actually from the LA Times. The two of the other paintings are by Carl Oscar Borg, and John Gamble is also in there. Also in 1922, Ludmilla and her sister Anna joined the new utopian community on the Mesa called Fellowship Colony. The Fellowship Colony was based on something called the New Thought, and it had all sorts of ideas about living a life outdoors, and that was healthy. They encouraged people to farm their own land, as you can see in this particular photograph. And there were a lot of people who bought lots in the Fellowship Colony. Ludmilla, of course, decided that she was going to build her own adobe home on her lot, and she and Anna, who worked as a secretary for the organization and for its publishing house, the Rose Press, they decided they were going to build, and it was such an unusual thing that, of course, it made headlines in the local paper because they were going to do it without the help of any man. And of course, she painted it many times over. This next picture shows you two men in front of the newly completed Ludmilla adobe on the Mesa. And it was right at the top of the hill. It had views south and north and wonderful views probably all the way around. Here is another one of her paintings of her home. In 1925, Anna and Ludmilla traveled east to visit relatives. They started out in Florida and were planning on going up through Georgia and then all the way back to Ossining. Unfortunately, Ludmilla had an asthma attack on the train and sadly died. Her body was shipped to Ossining, and this rough granite stone in Dale Cemetery commemorates her life. This photo is from the Islapedia website article on Ludmilla, who also painted many sea and landscapes out on the islands. And I encourage you, if you want to see some more of her work, to access this website. Ludmilla may have left Santa Barbara, but her connection to Santa Barbara lived on through the Pilat legacy of artistic pursuits and hard work. Emma Green, another sister, came to live in Santa Barbara for a while. She was a renowned violinist. Victor Hugo Pilat, her cousin, who had married her sister Teresa, was a horticulturalist and botanist, and he worked at several nurseries and started his own in Santa Barbara starting in 1908. Teresa Pilat, 1908. Their daughter, Irene Pilat, attended Santa Barbara High School and was on the yearbook staff and became a school librarian. Their daughter, Vera Pilat, attended Berkeley, and whatever she studied, she switched over to becoming a master marionneteer, and also tapped into the botanical part as an herb gardener. Their son went into the nursery business, but their son, Thaddeus Welch Pilat, died of appendicitis in Cottage Hospital at age 16. Carl Pilat Jr., her brother, and Ignaz Pilat, the uncle, were horticulturalists and landscape architects in New York. And Anna Pilat Knight, her sister, was a writer and editor of Outlook. And the lastly, but not least, Peter Pilat, her grandnephew, was born in Ossining, came to Santa Barbara and went to Santa Barbara High School, went to UCSB to study engineering, took a ceramics class, and became a ceramicist. He's just recently passed, but he became very well known as an artist. And some of you may actually know him, I don't know. And that is my story, and I'm sticking to it.